So, my name is Lisa Servon. I chair the City and Regional Planning Department here at the Weitzman School, and I am delighted to be your mistress of ceremonies this evening. And as we make this transition from pandemic to endemic, we don't know exactly what day that happens, but it seems like it's happening. It is really thrilling to be gathering in person. And we're here for a celebratory occasion tonight to launch the book Megaregions and America's Future. I was going to hold up my book as a prop, but there are several there that you can see on your way in, which is by Bob Yaro, Fritz Steiner, and Ming Zhang. And Megaregions is a delightful and deeply informative book. I got an advance copy, a PDF, so I had a chance to peruse it before you did. And I hope this evening's program will function kind of like a trailer for a good movie, where you see some of the highlights, but it makes you really want to see the rest, and that you'll give it a read. So the concept of the megaregion has existed for more than 50 years, and the number of megaregions that exist globally and in the US is growing. And this book explores the role they can play in dealing with the most pressing problems that are affecting our world, like climate change. And interestingly, although this book was in the making way before the current pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic provides just one illustration of the relevance of thinking about how space is organized around megaregions. So recognizing that city and even state governments were not really sufficient or up to the task of dealing with the problems of the pandemic, the governors of several megaregions in the US, the Northeast, Great Lakes, Front Range, Texas Triangle, Southern and Northern California, and Cascadia, some of the 13 megaregions in the US, all mobilized at the megaregion scale, first to address the public health crisis in the midst of the virus, and then reopen and rebuild their economies in the aftermath. So just one small story about the relevance of what's in the book. Fritz, Bob, and Ming have drawn on decades of work in writing this book, and much of the groundwork was laid right here at Penn, and many of the ideas and the drawings and illustrations emerged out of studios, and also with collaborations with UT and with other schools as well. So as you thumb through the pages of the book, you'll see maps and diagrams that are created by past students, which is really exciting. That's the kind of thing that makes a department chair proud, when the work that's happening in our classrooms is actually making it onto the pages of published books. So here's how we'll proceed. Each of the authors will share some of their ideas and their megaregion wisdom, and then we'll engage in some conversation and questions and answers, which will be followed by a reception. And so now I'd like to introduce the first speaker, my dean, Fritz Steiner, who is also the Paley professor here at the Weitzman School. Fritz, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lisa. Bob Yaro calls this our Coved Project. Yes. We conceived it, like many things, right before these awful last couple of years. And it is a part of a larger effort called CM2, that was conceived by my friend and colleague Ming Zhang at the University of Texas at Austin. And it's a consortium of 4 universities, and it's funded by the US Department of Transportation. So you'll see there's a lot of transportation focus in what we're going to talk about, and also in the book. And the 4 universities that are involved are the University of Texas at Austin, which was my previous institution, Texas Southern University in Houston, Louisiana State University, and the University of Pennsylvania. And when Ming was putting together the proposal, he said, really it'd be great to have Penn as a partner, and he really wanted to include Penn, and unbeknownst to either Ming or I that I would be ending up here. So we reached out to John Landis, and John agreed to be a partner and lead the Penn effort. And then I ended up here at Penn and working with John and other colleagues here at Penn, as well as my friends and former colleagues at the University of Texas at Austin. I feel when people have asked me about this book, what is my role? For first thing, I swear never to edit books or co-author books, and yet this book kind of proves me wrong, because I really enjoyed working with Ming and Bob, and I kind of describe myself as the middle brother. Those of you who know Ming know that he's extraordinarily analytical. And those of you that know Bob, he's incredibly strategic. And so a lot of my role was how to take that very powerful analytic approach and the really strong strategic approach and marry them into a book that had the best of both. So, as Lisa mentioned, the concept of megaregions, and we look at the origin. Was it Patrick Geddes? He kind of came up with something that resembles megaregions. Was it Lewis Mumford? But without a doubt, Gene Gottman started to write about and publish about megalopolis in the late 1950s, and then published this book in 1961. Gottman was a French geographer, and he basically argued and backed it up with lots of data that a new kind of urban phenomena was occurring in the northeast region of the United States. We, in the book, present 13 megaregions, and largely thanks to Ming, the analytical description and case for these regions is pretty, I think it's more thorough than that exists anywhere else. One thing that's fascinating, or was fascinating to me, is the Northeast megaregion. When we were about 2/3 of the way through the book, Bob said, hey, the Northeast is really 2 megaregions. And by that point, I think we were a little bit too far along. But my next CM2 project is going to look at the North Atlantic and the Mid-Atlantic, and really sort of look, are they really 2 megaregions, or is it 1? It's a kind of straight-ahead research question. And then what are the policy implications for that? I think there are a lot of policy implications. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware cooperate on a lot of things pretty easily, as does Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. Of course, the difficult thing there is, what do you do with New York City? But if we look at the Texas Triangle and the Gulf Coast, Houston plays a similar role. It's a hinge. And maybe places like Houston and New York City are the places they are because they are, in ecological terms, ecotones between larger systems. And I'm looking at the American landscape and looking at how it's organized from an environmental perspective is certainly not a new thing. Perhaps my favorite and most interesting idea along these lines was John Wesley Powell's proposal to the Senate, the U.S. Senate in the 1880s and 1890s, to basically throw out Thomas Jefferson and to throw out the Jeffersonian grid and replace it with hydrology. And although clearly the Senate didn't reorganize the American West along this way, it would have a lasting influence on how drainage basins and water systems are managed in the West. Fast forward to about 10 years ago, McCherry and Holmes won the Arid Lands competition, and they went really 21st century and expanded Powell's suggestion for the whole United States and said that the whole United States could be reorganized with drainage basins, and went one step further and said, let's do away with the 50 states and reorganize the country like this. I remember seeing this map for the first time and being reassured that Austin was still the capital of the new state. But it obviously was meant to be a provocative, to provoke discussion and ideas. And ecologists have been busy looking at the North American landscape. This is a geographer named Robert Bailey. He long time worked for the Forest Service. And one thing that when we started to pull together the maps for the slides for this presentation, and I was thinking about Bob's hypothesis that the Northeast was really two megaregions, I noticed, ecologically there's a difference between the darker green and the lighter green in Bailey's ecosystem map. The EPA has also picked up, and they have a number of levels. This is a level 1, which is the gross, the largest level, and then they go into more detail, much like Bailey did for the Forest Service. Probably of all the megaregions, the one that has the most detailed environmental analysis is the Northeast, and thanks in large part to Bob Yaro, who was formerly, in addition to being a professor of practice here at Penn, was the director of the Regional Plan Association. And RPA put together a really comprehensive review and analysis of the Northeast megaregion about 10 years ago. And they also went way beyond mapping and also looked at how conservation and landscapes could be protected. What were the networks of organizations? This is, for example, the network of conservation organizations in the Connecticut River Valley of Connecticut and Massachusetts. And then this is just a quick sampling of the kinds of maps, including climate and climate change, and what would be the impact on the Northeast. So from an environmental perspective, I think megaregions can be helpful in advancing ecosystem services. And to me, two environmental aspects stand out at the megaregional scale. One is water, and how water can be more effectively managed, because as John Wesley Powell showed some 150 years ago, river basins don't follow existing jurisdictional boundaries. And the other is air, and of course air is related to climate. So you're probably familiar with the idea of ecosystem services. What we get into is looking at ecosystem services and how they can, how we can use ecosystem services to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Of course, this is not a new idea. Our good friend Ian McCarthy in the 1960s, before, well, as GIS was emerging, did a plan for Staten Island. And if you just look at the top two maps, the top map done in 1964, McCarthy said the dark areas, the black areas of Staten Island shouldn't be settled because they were unfit for human settlement and prone to disaster. And then the top right is the areas impacted by Hurricane Sandy. And they map almost identically. So we know a lot about the environment, and I think for us as designers and planners, the challenge is how do we use that kind of information? Around the world, and Bob will repeat this slide and explain a little more. This is the Thames in London, And the system that the UK, we also mentioned the Netherlands, have used to put in place to protect the coastlines and the cities, and we are behind in that regard. And we argue that megaregions can help us in that regard. Then the idea of climate reserves is a component of a response to climate change. This is some recent work by a group of geographers in the West, and it's not the Thames River, but it's climate change work. And essentially what they've done is put together and mapped the western forests and as potential climate reserves. I would argue we should take this one step further, map not only the forests of the West and the rest of the country, but the other public lands, the parks, the national parks, the Bureau of Land Management lands, for the whole country, and then overlay the 13 megaregions, and you'll see a relationship between the potential for climate reserves and megaregions. I think this is the kind of move that can be most effectively done at a megaregional scale. So with that, that's my remarks. I'll turn it over to to Ming, and thank you for being here. Yeah. I should also say there's people who signed up for books and your names are on them. We had like a door prize for the first 10 people. So if your name's on a book, take it. And we also have order forms outside. So, Ming? Some slides didn't get changed.
What's that?
Some slides didn't.
Thank you, Fritz.
There's a screen in front of you so you can see the
Full screen?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Fritz. And thank you, Lisa, for your introduction. Fritz mentioned briefly the story that we were working on the proposal back in the 2016. And we reached out to John. John at that time was on sabbatical and on leave somewhere in Thailand. We kind of like forced him to come up with ideas. So I hope that did not ruin your vacation. But we really needed that piece to make a competitive proposal, and then eventually we got it. So thank you, John. And in the next 10 minutes or so, I'd like to provide you with some background information about the megaregions we worked and presented in the book, highlighting the key demographic, economic, and transportation characteristics of those megaregions. First of all, you all know that megaregions concentrate majority of the U.S. population. This map shows a further detailed picture of the distribution of the population across megaregions in the U.S. Yeah. Here, the percentage shows the population share of each megaregion as the U.S. total. So, notably, Northeast has the largest share, 19%. And altogether, those 13 megaregions account for 84% of the U.S. total population, 30% of U.S. land. And megaregions are engines of the U.S. economy. Here, a similar picture, but showing the GDP share of each megaregion as the national total. Once again, Northeast here is the number one in terms of the region's GDP share in the country. if you compare this one with the previous one, and you may notice that 7 out of 13 megaregions actually have their GDP shares smaller than their population shares. So 6 are bigger, meaning there are variations in productivity on a per capita basis across megaregions. Megaregions are also drivers of innovation here. This map shows the number of patents per 1,000 people applied, obtained as well on a county basis, at a county level. Those dots representing the scale of, or the number of patents. That's 2015 data. Apparently, megaregions concentrate those counties with very high rate of patents, patent applications, and patent actually granted, with a couple of exceptions. I guess it's somewhere that's Iowa, Des Moines. That's a big circle. But overall, this map illustrates that the driving forces in megaregions for innovation. And take a look at the economic or industrial structures of megaregions. Here, we analyze the data, economic census data reported by the Census Bureau for the years 1990 to 2018, roughly 30 years time period. And I'll look at the specializations of megaregions in terms of their industrial specializations. The largest industries and high proportion of employment, much higher, at least 50% higher than the national average. And then look at the changes in specializations over time. So we came up with this 4 categories or 4 groups of megaregions. We call it manufacturing mega, successfully transformed, and then service specialization, and there are 2 subcategories over there, and then the resource dependent. So megaregions are diverse in terms of their economic and industrial structures. So just a little bit more detail here. The manufacturing megas, the Great Lakes and the Piedmont Atlantic, they deserve the title of the U.S. manufacturing megas. From 1990 to 2018, those 2 megaregions do not change much in terms of their major contributing industries to their economies in manufacturing still. In the past, they were, now still. So we call them manufacturing megas, the U.S. manufacturing bases. 2 megaregions, Northern California and Cascadia, they have transformed quite significantly, successfully, from initially specializing in manufacturing, in the primary agriculture, those are primary industries, to high-tech services, high-tech-oriented services. So those are high-profile employers like Microsoft and Amazon, and then many startups and high-tech firms in the Silicon Valley and the Bay Area. So currently, those high-tech related services contribute the largest employers in the 2 megaregions. There are 6 megaregions. They are transforming. They have transformed by strengthening specialized services. 4 of them particularly specialized in what Saskia Sassen or Peter Hall, they call advanced producer services, mainly including like banking, financing, insurance, and legal service law, and professional design and creative industries. So So those 4 megaregions, Arizona Sun Corridor, Basin and Range, Front Range, and Northeast, they are specialized in APS in particular. And then 2 other megaregions with strengthening specialized services and different types of services, different from the 4 megaregions I mentioned earlier, focusing on specializing in APS. These 2, Southern California, Florida, as you all are aware of, right? Very attractive to international visitors, right? And the Disney World, Disneyland, those entertainment and recreational activities, in addition to the gateway functions of the 2 megaregions. And the final group, we call it resource dependent, but they are gradually transforming. Texas Triangle and the Gulf Coast, they are specialized in mining and oil and gas related services and heavy construction, all of those. They were in 1990, they are still specializing in those in 2018. Central Plains is the only megaregion that has not seen much restructuring going on between the 30-year period. With those background information, I'd like to highlight a few trends and the challenges facing the U.S. megaregions. The map to the left showing population growth between 1990 and 2020. Those dots indicating the population concentration. See here, most of the growth occurred in megaregions. In the following 30 years, based on projections and future population growth will continue to concentrate in those megaregions. This is something very special here. We all know that U.S. population is aging, and these 2 maps showing which counties have the largest share of aging population. So look at the geographic distribution, and those darker green and light green showing the high percentage concentration of aging population. And those aging population in megaregions, mostly they locate not in the core counties, but in the suburban counties and non-core counties of megaregions. Another challenge facing megaregions is the growing income inequality. These charts showing all the megaregions are showing diverging trend in terms of income distribution. That's a big challenge facing the megaregion, facing the country U.S., facing the entire world. Lastly, let me take a quick look at the mega-regional commuting. So this table and map showing workers' flow reported by the census, inter-county workers' flow. And I tabulated those flow data geographically, looking at the intra-MPO travel and inter-MPO or travel involving non-MPO counties. We all know that MPOs are the designated agencies or organizations taking care of transportation planning. By looking at the share of the trips, it's obvious that MPO counties account for the majority of the travel, in this case 78, almost 79%. But if we look at the PMT, person miles of travel, then those non-intra-MPO travel accounts for more than 40%. That's not a small number. And MPOs, they take care of their own home business, but those trips and those VMTs, PMTs, generated outside their jurisdiction. we do need a mega-regional approach to take those into consideration. And the final slide here, showing the high-intensity travel corridors, clusters of population and business. They generate high intensity of travels. And those high-intensity travel corridors correspond to megaregions we have identified. Future population growth, future economic growth will continue to intensify those travel corridors. Currently, most of those travel are made either by cars or by planes. By the way, to the right, that's the flight passenger data, and to the left, that's workers' flow. Most of them are made by either by cars or by planes, and we do need to explore low carbon and high efficiency transportation systems to serve the anticipated future travel demand along those corridors. We also studied international megaregions. So very quickly, Bob later will also talk about that. And quickly, three examples, one from Europe, one from the UK, and then from China here. So Europe has a long, strong tradition of spatial planning, right, at the different spatial scale, regional, national, or international. So one exemplar case is the rural Rhine region. Here, the map to the right is the regional green framework of that rural Rhine green framework. It consists of rivers, open space corridors, and that green framework works like a bond, tying together all those like 50+ cities and municipalities in the region. And through like a sewer system or water projects, re-engineering, and infrastructure investments, and housing projects, many other projects. And the region turned from like an area full of mining pods into a coherent, attractive region, what they call city of cities. That's their new label, or metropole rule, they call it. And then the UK example, one major challenge facing the UK is the growing disparity between the north and the south. The one here, the diagram showing in the middle, showing the declining trend for the south, and then upward trends for the north. So one initiative, it's called the Northern Powerhouse. It's one strategy to regenerate the north by investing in rail, in highway, in ports, in airports, in the local transportation, so that they can become one region, one multi-city region, competitive to the south of England, London area, and the rest of the world. And then lastly, megaregion in China. China has designated 19 megaregions. They call it city cluster regions in the country as the foci of the future next phase of urbanization and national development. And going together with this spatial strategy is the investment plan for infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, and most notably the high-speed rail. For example, high-speed rail grid, as the map to the left shows. And this latest, this example is in John's current book, right? The Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau, Greater Bay Area, and the cities, municipalities in mainland China, and then in Hong Kong, in Macau, they work together. What they're thinking about is not like my next door cities or counties, but San Francisco. right? The bay-to-bay kind of interactions. So that's very active, and it's going to be a very influential megaregion in China and in the world. So with that, I'll turn it to Bob on what we are going to do here. So that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Ming. Thank you, Fritz. And thanks, everybody. I really owe enormous debt to a series of deans. And Fritz is the most recent one, going back to Gary Hack when we started this research program in 2004, and Jonathan Barnett and I, working with Armando Carbonell at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in Cambridge, convened a studio called Plan for America Studio 2050. And I remember Gary Hack coming to me and said, Bob, Penn Studios are supposed to focus on neighborhoods in Philadelphia, and it's getting a little out of hand here. We're looking at the future of the whole country, for the next half century. And, it started with these forecasts that the Census Bureau did that suggested that the country was going to add 40 or 50% to its population. We had a wonderful experience. I got a grant from the Ford Foundation to bring the studio to, we're going to actually bring a bunch of leading experts from Europe here who'd been working on a European scale spatial planning deal, basically the same scale that we were looking at. And I went to Sir Peter Hall, the Dean of British Planning at University College London. He was the first one I approached, and Peter said, "You want me to come for a week in Philadelphia in March in the basement at Meyerson Hall?" He said, "I don't think so." And as much as we love this building and so forth, but then, so I went back to the students and said, "Well, I got bad news. It just doesn't look like this is going to come together." And this is Penn. We have a very entrepreneurial bunch of students. So one of the students raised his hand, "Well, why don't we go there?" And instead, and that's what we did. And Peter Hall hosted us at his studio in East London for a week, and we had the leading experts from the United States and Europe, essentially looking at maps of the country. The students had projected future growth trends, and I have terrible close-up vision, and so I'm looking at these maps, and I'd read Gottman years earlier and so forth, but it jumped out at me because of my really lousy vision that the suburbs of Philadelphia were growing into the suburbs of New York around Mercer County and Trenton and Princeton, and the same thing was going on between Philadelphia and Baltimore, but that it was also happening in a dozen other places across the country where metropolitan regions, which have been obviously the building block we'd been working with. I ran a metropolitan, strategic policy group for New York for 25 years. We'd all been working at that scale, but it was very clear that there was a larger scale. And when we started getting into the functioning of these places, we had wonderful collaboration over a series of years. Marilyn Taylor was one of my partners in all of this for many years. We did a bunch of studios across Europe, North Africa, and I guess, Marilyn, this is where you came in when we were in Casablanca, looking at the impact of high-speed rail between Tangier and Casablanca. It became very clear that there was an emerging trend here where networks of cities and metropolitan areas were beginning to grow together, but also beginning to interact economically in terms of natural resources, in terms of politics and so forth. And this was an idea, originally, I called them super cities. Armando Carbonell at Lincoln said, Americans don't like cities, let's call them megaregions. And the term stuck. But a lot of the research, began here at Penn and continues here at Penn, which is really exciting, and great to hear that Fritz wants to take this idea further in years to come. Let me go on and just quickly go through the big question here. This is a great idea. We know, and I remember Marilyn and I we did a studio 3-4 years ago in Jinji around Beijing and Tianjin. We're sitting in the China Academy of Planning and Urban Design in Beijing, and the head of the academy, the president of the academy, hands me a bound set of monographs that America 2050 had produced, RPA's initiative in collaboration with Penn, translated into Mandarin, English and Mandarin, and beautifully presented in a box set. And so we could never afford to do that. But what they told us is that we've been taking this concept very seriously. And it turns out that China and at least 26, and I guess close to 30 countries are now developing national economic development, mobility, environmental protection strategies at this larger scale. And because of American exceptionalism, that, we're kind of slow to get to the party. But so my presentation is to discuss how does the U.S. kind of catch up. We're now behind places like Morocco and Turkey and Malaysia, and I could go down the list of the 27 other places that have taken this approach, and of course behind China and Japan and Korea and a number of other places that we shouldn't be playing catch-up ball, but that's what's happening. Let's see if I can just figure out. Do I go sideways this way? There we go. Going back to Ming's point that the mega regions are the engines of the national economy. 85% of the economy or more, almost 90% of the economy is concentrated in these mega regions. It's where new technologies are developing. It's where the research universities and teaching hospitals are located. It's the crucible in which immigrants and new arrivals in this country are pulled into the mainstream of the economy and the society and so forth. So it's really important that we get these places right. And as the book points out, and as Lisa reminded us, that we found during the pandemic that at least half of the mega regions were collaborating. The governors were collaborating at the mega region scale on COVID adaptation, public health strategies, and then on economic rebuilding and reopening strategies and so forth. So we're beginning to see that even without any help from Washington, that in fact the states are beginning to come together. But I would argue that if we're going to sustain the standard of living that we and our parents got used to and that we think our kids should get used to, going to sustain the preeminent place that this country has had. So it's been 150 years since the U.S. Surpassed Germany and Great Britain to have the largest economy in the world. And of course, China's catching up very quickly and so forth. Going to sustain the role that this country has had in the competitive edge that in this emerging global competition between democracies and autocracies that we need to focus on making sure that all of these places are running on, as an old-fashioned carbon economy analogy, on 8 cylinders, right? We've got to make sure that they're all pulling their weight and they're all pulling as part of the national economy and the global economy. That these are the places where the most serious issues facing the country and the world, climate change, growing social and political divisions and so forth, can be addressed. We need to focus on as Ming has pointed out, that some of the mega regions, and particularly the Great Lakes mega region around the Midwest and parts of the Northeast, are the Rust Belt that has fallen behind in much the same way that the north of England has fallen behind the rest of the United Kingdom, and we need to address their growing racial and social and economic divisions. The new bipartisan infrastructure law that was signed by President Biden back in, let's see, I can remember when it was, October, I guess it was, is an essential first step, but it's only a down payment on the investments that are going to be needed and the policy innovations that are going to be required. That law, the $1.2 billion, is a quarter the size of what President Biden is, about $550 billion in new resources in that $1.2 trillion investment, but it's a good start. Most of it's going out in the traditional ways to state DOTs, and not a lot of innovation involved, but it has the potential to underpin a longer and more innovative program. And as we saw with COVID, governors, mayors, business leaders can also lead on this issue. Cities in particular will bear most of the burdens and reap most of the benefits from a successful program to build and revitalize the mega regions. So cities need to be engaged in something we've been doing in what we're calling the North Atlantic region, the northern half of the Northeast mega region. So we're talking about a national scale strategy to address this issue, and most Americans think that's something that's unnatural. Bob Fishman at University of Michigan has a wonderful quip where he said that national scale planning is an activity, quote, best left to the French, he says, but au contraire. And it turns out that 5 times in American history, American presidents during times of economic and crisis and war have led national development strategies, beginning with Thomas Jefferson. When he acquired the Louisiana Purchase, he asked his Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, to develop a strategy for development of Western roads and initially canals and the rights-of-way that later became the railroads across the West, land grants to incentivize these internal improvements. And it never comes easy. That invariably there's pushback from members of Congress and who say, well, we can't afford it, and why do we need to do that, and so forth. But inevitably, these plans get implemented over time, and with the leadership from the White House. The second plan, Lincoln's plan, and during the Civil War, came up with a remarkable set of innovations that really set the stage for America, the growth of the post-Civil War economy. The Morrill Act creating the land-grant universities, the Homestead Act, the Transcontinental Railroads and the other Western railroads, National Academy of Sciences, the controller of the currency, and the creation of a first time of a modern currency and banking system for the country. A third one of these strategies was in another period of great change, social and economic change, the trust-busting period with Teddy Roosevelt and the Pinchot Plan for natural resource development, national parks and forests, the inland navigation system that makes the whole middle of the country accessible by barge and so forth to get natural resources in and out of the Midwest and the center of the country. This is the Gallatin, plan, a stylized image of it, but a set of national roads, and there were initially canal proposals like the Erie Canal, but all of them became railroad rights-of-way when that technology emerged. And the vehicle was the creation of a land grant system to what we now would call public-private partnerships to create the national railroads and roads across the center and the eastern part of the country. And then finally, in the last century, the 20th century, Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, and the National Resources Planning Agency in the White House that put together a whole series of policy innovations, the initial plans for what became the interstate highway system, the plans for Lend-Lease during the war, for the post-war VA and other post-war reconstruction initiatives, but then the whole series of regional development projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Colorado River Project, the Central Arizona Project, the Bonneville Power Administration, the CCC, and the WPA, and so forth, and these things essentially went into formally developed regions like the Southeast and then never developed regions like the Southwest and the West and so forth, and created the infrastructure that allowed them to become the modern places that they are. And then finally, the Eisenhower administration, where President Eisenhower said, we've got to create something that's similar to the Autobahns that he'd seen in Germany during the war. And he created the Clay Committee. General Lucius Clay led a committee of business and civic leaders and labor leaders that came up with the National Interstate and Defense Highway Act proposal in 1956, which, again, a lot of foot dragging. Members of Congress, remember Strom Thurmond famously said, now who's going to use these beltways, these boondoggles, he said. And but in fact, the presidential leadership during a period of crisis, and really what it took was the Cold War and the threat of the Russians threatening the country with missiles and so forth. Imagine that might happen again someday. That led to a whole series of things, but the interstate highways, the creation of the National Science Foundation, major investments in expanding public university system and higher education and so forth. And this is the map that the Clay Commission came up with for the interstate highway system, which again basically created the template that the nation followed for 40 or 50 years, and I would argue underpinned a 5-fold increase in GDP over a 50-year period in real dollars. Not the only investment, one of the fundamental foundational investments that made that possible. So what's required to achieve this? And the answer is a national vision, an investment framework, and presidential leadership. And what we've learned from the research that we've done, the international research, is that the key investment in enabling the synergies between metropolitan regions and cities within megaregions, the key investment is the creation of high-speed and high-performance intercity rail. And again, there are 27 countries that have gone ahead and done these things or are building these systems now. We're late to the party, but we can learn from their experience and get going on it. The good news, there are half a dozen places across the country that are now moving ahead with high-speed rail proposals and high-performance rail proposals. The Southeast, the Midwest is initial proposals, the Texas Triangle, California, Cascadia, and a few others. And so things are beginning to move on this front, and there's initial funding of about $12 billion in the bipartisan infrastructure law that will go into those projects. And most importantly, we need to adapt these systems and design these systems for the emerging post-COVID hybrid work and travel patterns that we're seeing now that look like they've got staying power, and that you know where regional, formerly metropolitan labor markets and housing markets are beginning to function at this larger scale with people commuting in once or twice a week from a distant city or suburb. So you know, again, joining the party with China and Europe and Korea and so forth. As Ming said, you know, China has developed, you know, its high-speed rail system, 20,000 miles now, I guess, that are either completed or underway. It's remarkable how they've done this, and really designed to pull the inland emerging megaregions and connect them with each other and with the coastal megaregions around Jinji and Beijing and Shanghai and the Pearl River Delta and around Shenzhen and Guangzhou and so forth. Europe's done the same thing. They created a trans-European network proposal for rail investments across a 28 or 29 country region, and they've been hard at it now for 30 years in building this out with incentives. And of course, the Europeans have also incentivized the projects, nearby projects like the Morocco high-speed rail network. So this is a slide that Ming showed earlier, that even without high-speed rail, we already have these emergency, mega region scale travel corridors. Imagine if we made it possible. I mean, I came down from Connecticut today, and as I like to say, it was very thoughtful of the Amtrak staff to give me that extra 2 hours to prepare my lectures over the years and to get my reading done and to sleep on the way home. But actually, I could probably make more productive use of that time, in a classroom here at Penn or doing some other things. So, at any rate. So high-speed rail proposals, I said, now moving ahead in several regions, underpinned by the new infrastructure law. We've been working in the Northeast. It's something that came out of a Penn studio several years ago, and the idea of a high-speed rail link between New York and Boston around this northern half of the Northeast corridor that we call the North Atlantic mega region between New York City and New York State and the New England states. And the good news is that the Federal Railroad Administration and DOT have created a new corridor identification development program that is designed to create these templates for what can become a national passenger rail plan. We took a stab at this back in 2009, I guess it was, at America 2050 in RPA, just kind of laying out a initial concept. This was really important. It resulted in the adoption of legislation that year, the PRIA legislation, the Passenger Rail Investment Act, which authorized Amtrak to stay in business, but also authorized the creation of high-speed rail as a federal policy and so forth. So it made it possible for the Congress to simply add an appropriation last year with the bipartisan bill. But and this is the North Atlantic Rail, map that shows the high-speed corridor, the blue line, in a new corridor it's existing adapted rail corridors across Long Island and then Connecticut, and a new piece of alignment that Fritz and I worked on with a studio here a few years ago, looking at the Hartford to Providence piece of a new alignment. So other major investments, it's not just about rail. It's about, as we've learned with the dislocations in in the economy and the goods movement system in and out of the Port of Los Angeles and the national rail system. We've got to modernize and expand the capacities of what we call global gateways, the airports and seaports and the road and rail freight connections, the connections to Mexico and Canada. We learned last month when the truckers shut down the bridge between Detroit and Windsor just how fragile those connections are. They need to be supplemented and strengthened and so forth. We need to make new capacity in these systems for a new century. A national broadband strategy, again, I think there's $12 billion or so in the bipartisan bill for broadband in rural and left behind urban communities. That's a down payment of what needs to happen to bring those communities in the mainstream of the economy and the life of the country. And then finally, the highway system is now 60 years old for the most part, and we need to modernize, eliminate the bottlenecks, eliminate the pieces of the urban pieces of the interstate system that have just done, a half century of damage to urban communities, mostly minority communities across the country. I had a chance last year or the year before working in Hartford on a proposal to replace a riverfront highway or a network of highways through the Hartford region that looks like the spaghetti on the left, which is in Albany, but it's the same concept, and essentially redesign that system to eliminate the barriers between the minority communities in the north end and the south end of Hartford and the center of the region in downtown, and reclaim the riverfront for the public for the first time in 60 or 70 years. So we need finally we need a national leveling up strategy like the one that the Johnson administration is pursuing in the United Kingdom, the Northern Powerhouse that Ming mentioned, Germany's 30-year efforts in the Ruhrgebiet and the Ruhr region that Ming mentioned, and the largely successful efforts to revitalize the former GDR. Now this is, and some images here of the leveling up campaign in the Northern Powerhouse. There are other examples. I mean, China's probably got more examples of this than any other place in the world. Korea now has a national development strategy that's built to the Megaregion scale and around the Korea high-speed rail system that's designed to decant population and economic activity out of Seoul into a network of urban centers across the whole country, turning the whole country into a single megaregion. As Fritz mentioned, the book describes this proposal for a national climate reserve network that would do a big job in carbon sequestration, but also habitat preservation and so forth. Got to retreat from these newly sensitive areas that are affected by sea level rise and forest fires and so forth as a result of climate change. And then the idea of layered defense systems. I've been working. Be pleased to know my colleagues here. In my retirement years at Penn, I've been working on a proposal for layered defense for New York and for Boston that would create a set of offshore barriers to movable sea gates, we call them, movable barriers to deal with storm surges, onshore low berms or levees to deal with sea level rise and restored wetlands in New York Harbor and the Boston Harbor, and map on the left of places that are going to be subject to flooding from sea level rise by the end of the century. Doesn't look good if you live in South Brooklyn or South Queens or places or along the East River. And then the Thames Barrier, again, the same image you saw before. But there, almost every major urban center around the world that is subject to storm surges and sea level rise is building a system like this. Singapore's done something similar. Rotterdam and the others. So how do we get there? We need a national infrastructure development strategy, probably modeled after something like the Clay Committee, an expanded federal commitment to high-speed rail. We got the down payment now with the bipartisan bill, but that's just a down payment. Federal leadership is essential, as we've seen 5 times in American history, that unless a president kind of steps off the South Portico and the White House says, God damn it, we need to do this, nothing happens. And you need an emergency. So while we were writing the book, I don't think any of us anticipated that Russia was going to invade Ukraine and that we would be headed for a second Cold War. Hopefully it's a Cold War and not a hot war in World War III. It's Cold War II. Climate reserves. We need an existential challenge. And we thought, well, climate change, that's getting up there existential. That was pretty good. The growing racial and social and political divisions, and Black Lives Matter and all the rest of it that was going on as we were writing the book. And the possibility of even more severe pandemics could be catalysts. Well, gotten people's attention, but it didn't seem to put us over the top. But if you go back to the Eisenhower and the interstates, or Lincoln and the Transcontinental Railroad and the other things that Lincoln did, and all of the national planning efforts, almost all of them were a product of concerns about national security and international competition and so forth. As we enter into what we hope is going to be a Cold War, a period of peaceful coexistence between as the last one was, between not always pleasant, but peaceful coexistence between the Western democracies and I call them the Eastern autocracies, China, Russia, and others. That's starting to look like what it could be catalytic to get everybody's attention in this country, and particularly the Congress and the White House, that maybe we ought to be thinking at this larger scale for the first time in more than half a century. And it's very likely that this competition, between autocracies and democracies is going to go on for a half century or more, as the Cold War did. And the best way to avoid it turning into a hot war is to make sure that this country, continues to have an economy that can support a national defense establishment and NATO and the rest of it, to make sure that we don't end up in a hot war, that we end up with a peaceful period. And so we would argue that the only way that, with 85% of the economy in the country and all of the innovation economy and so forth, the megaregions are the places, and that's the scale at which we really need to be thinking about building the next half century of economic vitality. It'll require strategic investments. It's going to require some new institutions, new collaborative approaches to multi-state collaboration in more than half of the megaregions that are multi-state megaregions. We think that this new national, security threat could in fact be the catalyst for bold leadership and investment in much the same way that Eisenhower and the Clay Committee, led in creating the interstates and the National Science Foundation and other, other measures to help this country, compete successfully in the Cold War. And those of us who remember Ronnie Reagan and Star Wars, probably we've got to be a certain generation. John, we had to retire to remember this stuff, I guess, but, we ended up winning the Cold War against the Soviets, not with missile throw power, but with GDP. They simply couldn't compete, with the big investments that this country was making in Star Wars and other advanced missile systems and other defense systems and so forth. Anyway, so we would argue, maybe for the wrong reason, but that's how things are, that it's time to do it again, to create the national resolve to move ahead with an ambitious national development and megaregion development initiative at this scale. And with that, controversial, I guess, proposal, we can open this to comments and discussion. Thank you.
All right, thank you all. Yeah, we have time for some questions. I'm going to open it up, kick things off with one question to start. And the first question I'll throw out is really to ask about the especially because you talked about infrastructure a little bit, what are the transportation and infrastructure challenges that you think are most effectively addressed at the megaregion scale? So why, in other words, why are megaregions the best scale to address those challenges?
Well, obviously, this working? Yeah, obviously, high-speed rail and high-performance rail, these systems operate at the megaregion scale, and the whole point is to connect the cities and metropolitan regions within the megaregions. So you really need to be thinking at that scale. As Fritz pointed out, the big natural resource systems. That's one of the systems that we analyzed in the book and that we've done over the years at Penn and RPA. The big natural resource systems. You look at something like the Delaware River, for example, that provides the public water supply for New York City and for Philadelphia. You've got to start to operate at this larger scale, and we would argue that I know some of our studios that Marilyn and I did looking at the Northeast Corridor and the rail system, you know, we one of the things we did was to map the world-class research universities and teaching hospitals in the country and in the Northeast, and they're strung like pearls along the Northeast Rail Corridor. And yet we aren't getting the kinds of synergies between research activities in Boston and Philadelphia, New York, and DC that we could be getting or should be getting, and we're not getting the additional value that those connections would create. I think one of the things that Marilyn and I have looked at over the years is the importance of tacit knowledge and the face-to-face communication between people. We may be Zooming, we may be, you know, commuting 1 or 2 days a week, but in the end, innovation happens when people get together and sparks fly and so forth. And those systems, you know, if they're designed at the megaregion scale, they make it possible, you know, to create those synergies between cities and metropolitan regions that don't exist now.
Thank you. Yeah, Ming.
Thank you. Oh, should I turn it on?
I think it's on.
It's on.
Yeah,
It's on.
go
We
for
don't
it.
have to do
Thank you.
anything. It's just
Oh,
magic.
thank you. I'd like to add to what Bob just said. Megaregions, when we look at this concept, it's more than just the scale or the size matter, but also the things happening crossing jurisdictional boundaries, municipal boundaries. Transportation, for example, many transportation problems, congestions, many transportation consequences like emissions, they ignore jurisdictional boundaries. Sometimes the congestion happening over here actually originated from the neighboring metropolitan areas. So these cross-jurisdictional challenges are beyond the capacity, whether it's financially or legally or manpower, beyond the capacity of the existing MPOs. Many MPOs, they do recognize the challenges of the transportation problems that they ought to address, but just not originating from their jurisdictions. So this mega-regional perspective provides kind of an approach to address those issues, in particular crossing different municipalities and agencies as well.
Thank you. John, it looked like you were raising your hand.
Yeah, I want to ask a bunch of questions, but first I want to say this is just a magnificent book. Congratulations to all three of you. You know, I've seen you all working on pieces of this over the years, and it just has come together in just a terrific way. It's not only thoughtful and synthetic, but I want to say it's also very pretty. And as someone who's working on my own book, trying to make it pretty, it's pretty hard to do that. And I was reflecting back on some of the previous work, and Gottsman's book was not very pretty. You know,
I think it's the blue ribbon for beauty.
Getty's work wasn't very pretty. McCarthy's work was terrifically pretty, and as a consequence, it's been terrifically influential. And I predict this is going to be similarly influential. Not the least of which is it's just very pleasing to look at, and that makes you really like the conclusions that are also very substantial. But I want to ask each of you a question. I know you started this about 3 years ago, and times have changed. And we used to talk about the need for political will. Now we talk about the need for political capital. Will apparently isn't enough in this polarized time. You actually need to have some capital. And Bob, I want to ask you if you looking at sort of the coalitions that one needs to build that you were talking about for megaregions. If you worry about the latest gerrymandering trends, New York Times characterized them as cracking and hacking, but it's basically put all the sort of cosmopolitan people and the diverse people to city centers, and where they'll vote for Democrats, and put all the rest of the people in the suburban districts where hopefully they will vote for Republicans. And it seems to me you were sort of outlining the emergence of megaregions as sort of a coalition between suburbanites and urbanites and between different metropolitan areas, and I wonder if this latest round of gerrymandering may make that harder. And I'll just let you answer that, but I want to ask Fritz and Ming the same question. which is this very interesting article in last week's Sunday Times by Ezra Klein, who's their sort of podcaster and political thinker. And he took a pot shot at things that are happening in Berkeley, California, which is always very easy, by the way.
Yeah.
But he argued that the great environmental revolution of the 60s and 70s brought us the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, National Environmental Policy Act had been spent, and that while it was necessary at the time to put the environment and economic growth on the same level, it had gone too far. This is his argument, not mine, and that it was now stifling progress, and that we needed to come up with a new way of looking at the economy and the environment. We haven't done that, and that maybe the environment, not climate change, but the environment needed to take a step back. That's his argument, not mine. And so, for inside, you've been very active in this, particularly recently with the Green New Deal, and I wonder if you worry about that sort of argument, that we need to get serious in the globally competitive world about the economy and maybe an environment. These environmental regulations aren't something we can afford. And you're from you teach in a state which has basically decided, no, we don't need the environment, we just need the economy. So I wonder how each of you would react to these concerns that are emerging on the political front, not in the planning world, not in the intentional world, but emerging on the political front.
Well, there are so many entrenched interests that are going to get in the way of this business, and that have to be brought along, or you got to, it's the old. I remember there was the Lucky Strike cigarettes used to have a ad. This is like back when which said that the smoke had to go over, under, around, or through their filters, and then so over, under, around, or through. Basically, those are the different themes that I would like to stress here, and. People do funny things when there is a larger threat. And so, for example, I've been working with folks at Texas A&M who are advancing the Ike Dike proposal for Galveston Bay and Houston to protect that area from a continuing series of flooding events. Hurricanes, and what they have 50 inches of rain over Houston. Back several years ago. And so forth. And so you gotta love the Texans. This is a place that they don't believe in climate change or sea level rise or government or or that sort of thing. But George W. Bush, the land commissioner, has convened a new 6-county agency that is basically coming up with a set of new taxes to pay for the state share of a $36 billion, I think it is, project. And then you find, Senator Cornyn leading a modest exercise in the Congress to get the special legislation to direct the Corps of Engineers to build the damn thing. Now, why did that happen? Well, they've had, half a dozen, existential flooding events over the last 20 years. With Hurricane Ike prominently featured and so forth, but others. And I think that's what's going to be needed to get people's attention. I do believe that, COVID, we saw these emerging ad hoc alliances with no help from Washington, no incentives from anybody. Trump administration wasn't that interested, and you could imagine that, we've got what's the next pandemic look like, that we need to start to think at this scale, and not just how to shut things down, but how to open them up again, which is what we started to see in the Northeast and other mega regions around COVID and the reopening process and so forth. And then lastly, I'd just say the national defense argument trumps everything. Sorry, Trump, I didn't want to use that word, but overcomes all of the obstacles. And again, if you read the history, and I went through this when I was on a commission with Ray LaHood several years ago, looking at financing strategies for infrastructure. And my assignment from the secretary was to look into how did the Clay Commission succeed, and it was really interesting. In the 3 years before the National Interstate and Defense Highway System Act was passed in '56, the Republican Governors Association passed resolutions to eliminate the Bureau of Public Roads and to eliminate what was then a 1 cent a gallon federal gas tax, and and the proposal from the Clay Commission was 4 cents on the gallon. It doesn't sound like a lot, but the gasoline cost 18 cents a gallon. It was a big deal. And, it was, in the end, it was first presidential leadership. Ike said this is something that we have to do. It was a conservative Republican president. It was a bunch of conservative Republican, members of the Senate and Congress, even though there were lots of their peers and governors that were against it, this boondoggles and so forth. But it was the threat of the Cold War that got everybody's attention, and that's which is why it became the National Defense Highway System. And the arguments were they could move cannons and divisions of highways and divisions of troops and so forth. But it was the overall idea that we needed to compete in the Cold War successfully and that we weren't competing, which drove that. Can you imagine that happening again? I think you could imagine happening. I think people are galvanized. You see we got Republicans, Democrats. I mean, the Republicans just arguing that Biden isn't doing enough to help Ukraine. That's quite a distance from where they were a year and a half ago with Trump. The first impeachment, saying, well, it's not a problem. We don't really. Who's ever heard of Ukraine anyway? Is what they said then. And so, I think that has the potential to galvanize the kind of transformation in public attitudes and to move these investments and hopefully this big idea along. We've been invited by the Secretary of Transportation's office to present this down there in a couple of weeks to the top staff at the Secretary's office and the Federal Railroad Administration, and we're going to bring in the Federal Highway Administration and so forth. So, hopefully it's going to start to resonate there as well.
John, thank you. I think it is a pretty book.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah.
You asked essentially two questions, one really hard and one I think relatively easy. And the hard one was the political one. And I think Bob did a nice job responding. And I would just amplify 2 points. When we were writing this, it was interesting to see the voluntary coming together of people around COVID, not at the federal level, but at the governor to governor and mayor to mayor. The other is, I think that we can start to reflect on, but we're in the middle of something that we haven't seen for a long time. And, the bravery of the people in Ukraine to stand up to a bully at the level that they're doing is inspiring. It has the potential both to show the threat of murderous activities and so on, but also how we can respond. So I think that that's still unfolding. The environmental issue is a little bit easier, I think. With climate change, I think it's the biggest longer-term threat that we face. I would agree that things like the Clean Water Act, NEPA, and so on probably should be, if not thrown out, rethought. But I think there has been innovation in the environmental area, and especially around ecosystem services, and the idea that we should be creating ecosystem services and not using them, and just understanding the benefits we derive from nature at no or little cost. So I think we need to, especially with climate change, think about how we mitigate and adapt because it's happening. So I mean, it's clear, I think, for more and more people, even in Texas. I don't know if they don't believe in the environment or they just want to privatize it. So, but
sell it if they can, right? So, yeah.
But it's clearly getting hotter in Texas, and the amount of storms that are occurring has created, I think, a sense of urgency that's pretty profound and strong.
Thank you, John. Actually, Fraser already touched upon that. It sounds like Texas is so different, huh? Remember when I first received a job offer from Texas way back 20 years ago after finishing my PhD, and I talked to my department's PhD director and said, I got a job offer, I'm going to be in Texas. Huh? Are you going to that country? Well, but Texas is part of the U.S., and environmentally, economically, all other aspects, the Texans paid for not taking advanced actions in terms of climate impacts, right? This last year, the snowstorm basically just disabled everything, except for those some utility companies that they actually, very sadly, they earn profits out of that because they charge higher rates and or insurance payment and others. And the hurricanes every year, and the wildfires or the hurricanes, for example, right? The cost of death and the property damages, billions, hundreds of billions, and the threat comes every year. I hope people, the decision makers, will realize that you don't pay to take care of those. You will pay even more later when things happen. So it's not my area, but I heard an argument and a point. I think a very important. They say, well, you don't wait until the disasters already happen and then recovering from federal agencies, from the federal government. We need to have preventive funds to better prepare for the potential climate impacts. So.
Thank you. Summer, and then Marilyn.
Thank you, Lisa. Congratulations on getting the book out. My name is Summer. I'm a former student of Bob's. Good to see you.
Great to see you.
I noticed that there's a chapter in the book on high-speed rail, and I look forward to reading it. I have a question about high-speed rail. It seems like one of the biggest arguments against high-speed rail is that it's really expensive. It's really expensive, and so a lot of states almost made it a prerequisite for high-speed rail to be able to pay for itself, at least for the maintenance cost and the operation cost. But experience shows from other countries that is incredibly hard to do for high-speed rail to actually recoup its maintenance cost and its operating cost. So my question is actually two-parter. One, what needs to happen for people to realize the indirect benefits of high-speed rail? And two, do you think it's necessary for the quantifiable benefits of high-speed rail to outweigh its cost for high-speed rail to get built?
You know, I'm sitting here, I'm reminded of Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana. He was a conservative Republican. I don't agree with him very much, but he had a quip where he was when they shut down the government, a few years ago over a budget disagreement. And he said, this is a system that was designed by geniuses and it's run by idiots, and that's our problem, And we got the rest of the world has figured out that these investments make long-term sense for a variety of reasons: economic, environmental, congestion reduction, you name it. B, that these are very expensive systems. The Chinese have done a lot. One of the things they've done is to standardize the design details of these things so that we're not reinventing every bridge and every culvert, every time and so forth. We can learn from that. And we need, as John mentioned, we need some, fundamental reforms in the regulatory, permitting systems to make these things possible. But every place in the world, and we did an investigation at RPA in America 2050 of how these things are being financed around the world, and we found about $1.2 billion segment of the called the Perpignan Tunnel under the eastern edge of the Pyrenees between Barcelona and Marseille that was financed through a P3, and every other high-speed rail project in the world has been financed with cold cash, usually borrowed by national governments, with the idea that the payback period, is probably 30 or 40 or more years. There are some creative things that you could do. The UK, when they built HS1, the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, they set it up as a P3. The P3 failed. Her Majesty's government built the thing, paid for it. And then they turned around, once they demonstrated that the market was there and that the fare box revenues were there, they were able to turn around and lease it to a consortium that included the Ontario Teachers Pension Fund for a 30-year period. And they figured that over 50 years they were going to get all the capital back. But in the meantime, they were going to revitalize a dozen cities across southeast England that had formerly been totally isolated from the greater London economy, and that there was an enormous payback to the country from doing that, and payback obviously to London to expanding the commuter shed and the housing market and so forth, in a place where both the housing market and the commuter shed were overheated and so forth. So that's what we need to do here. Again, how do you get people's attention? Again, I go back to the idea that there's got to be an existential threat, and pick is it climate change? Is it, you could go back to, I would argue that the escalating housing prices in these mega regions across the country is an existential threat. We're making it impossible for middle-class families to afford to live in these places or without putting half of their income into mortgage payments and rent and so forth. So which of these crises puts you over the top? And, as we learned in Texas and other places that, you've got to have a serious threat before people do things. Perform these unnatural acts like reaching into your pocket to pay for things. Right? So.
Thank you for the question, a very interesting question that I have been working on that for a while. And for example, doing some empirical research in China, how China's high-speed rail systems have changed the mobility, accessibility, and then broader impacts. It's not a new challenge in terms of quantifying the direct and broader impacts. I think the challenge here is the distribution of the impacts and which group, which geography benefit more or less. So that's the challenging part. And of course, that's rather an analytical task. And so another point to respond to your question, the high cost of high-speed rail, indeed, yes, on a per mile basis, high-speed rail construction is very expensive. Operating is also expensive. But there are markets out there. In the U.S., the challenge here is that the cars plus planes already provide a very high personal mobility. So for high-speed rail to enter the market, very high barrier relative to, say, China. In China, when they started high-speed rail, the personal mobility was very low. So high-speed rail offers a mobility much higher, more superior than in the old, very junky buses. So that's the really market challenge. But there are markets out there. Private sectors are very sensitive to that. Texas Central, a private company, is working on the high-speed rail link between Dallas and Houston and investing $16 billion. They estimate the impacts somewhere around $36 billion in broad impacts. So we did a study, look at the distribution of the impacts. The challenge to them is not money, but it's a political challenge. And some property owners from local rural counties say, hey, why do you go through my property while I don't benefit from that? Texas Central said, well, I'm willing to pay 3 times of the eminent domain that can pay you. Still no, involving legal battles. So I think it's not the money part and the several corridors. It's not like every corridor, every intercity can be better served by high-speed rail in the U.S. It's not that realistic, but there are markets out there. So this Texas Central is still alive. Previous efforts were killed by like Southwestern Airlines, and others. But this time I'm still hopeful.
People named Bush. Right?
Right. So I'm hopeful. But of course, people say, well, that's mainly aiming at serving business travelers because only connecting Houston and Dallas with one stop in between. One stop still like 10 miles from AMM, from College Station.
Yeah.
So I think there is hope out there.
Thank you. Marilyn, why don't you ask the last question, and then we'll have time to continue the conversation around the corner over some wine.
It's a question meant to stimulate what we do next. I'm mindful sitting here that it was just about exactly 2 years ago when we all vacated.
Yeah.
Yep.
And our lives have been probably to a certain extent permanently changed by the experiences we have. One of them being, hey, it's not so bad to stay close to home and not travel quite so much. And while we can complain about Zoom, it's supported all of our lives. And so here's the kind of question that I want to throw out on the table. This is real macro. We can talk about it with great enthusiasm, with a lot of understanding and understanding all the hurdles. But meanwhile, I think as we have stayed closer to home, we are much more aware of the communities that are around us who had no chance to get away and who will continue to suffer under this and other really catastrophic possible futures. So what's the plan? And many of the students here now are very deeply involved in community coordination, but not just to hear their points of view, community events to promote community leadership. So how do you take something like this and say, what is the side, what are the arguments and what are the possibilities and what are the benefits that locally occur for this? We know what they are. More access to jobs. There more access to how you want to live and where you want to live and where you send your kids to school and what you do. And I just think maybe the three of you should put your heads together and start writing the next book on how this works at the local level. Because until we can build the base toward these new goals for the way we want to live, and very much the environmental situation and the climate situation, I think it will have a hard time as long as it stays in the upper strata. How do we bring it back to earth? And just to play the game we played for years, Bob, Franklin Delano Roosevelt went off to work with the arms suppliers, and Eleanor Roosevelt went to West Virginia. So how do we do both of those things?
Yeah. Well, one interesting development is there's a story in the Washington Post today about the new bipartisan infrastructure bill. I don't know if anybody saw it, but basically 98% of the money in that $1.2 trillion is going out to state DOTs to do all the same things that they've been doing for the last 40 years that got us into this mess of highly, we're just add another lane on the highway or gleaming new guardrails, that sort of thing. And there's one little bitty program that was included in the bipartisan bill that is for intercity passenger rail corridor planning. And the eligible applicants are state DOTs and Amtrak, which basically neither of whom have shown a lot of interest in this. In many ways, Amtrak has been the biggest obstacle to doing high-speed rail in this country. They don't want to do it because they see it as being in competition with their slow-moving trains, and their state-supported trains and so forth. But what's happening in the Northeast is that we're now finding that the cities and counties across the region are stepping forward, saying we're going to bear most of the burdens, but we're also going to benefit the most if we can create high-speed, high-performance rail networks in the North Atlantic region, the northern half of the Northeast. And so the city of Hartford, Suffolk County, the city of Boston, Suffolk County, Long Island, city of Boston, an emerging coalition of municipal leaders are coming forward and saying, we want to see this happen because we see this as benefiting us in an inordinate way. So it's a tea leaf, and is it going to succeed? I hope so. I'm working with put this coalition together, and there seems to be a lot of enthusiasm for a lot of frustration with the state DOTs.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I just argue that the more we reach out and into communities, the better chance we will actually have of making this the success that we see and can't quite get across the goal line yet.
And once again, Marilyn, you see, I'm slow to get there, but you're right. You've been saying this for years. So, but we're working on it.
On that note, let us applaud this book and the panel one more time.
Thanks, everybody.
We do have a reception. If you leave through these doors and follow the path around to the right, there's some wine and nibbles, and we can continue the conversation.
Great.
Thank you.
Good answer.